In 207 BC, a Chinese general named Han Xin stood at the edge of a river with his back to the water. His soldiers had nowhere to run. His officers begged him to move the formation. Every military rule ever written said you never position your army with a river behind you. You leave room to retreat. You preserve options. You protect escape routes. Han Xin refused. He had already sent 10,000 men to die that morning. Not because the enemy was stronger, but because he needed his own soldiers afraid. Fear, he understood, was a better weapon than courage. A man with nowhere to run fights differently than a man with a path home. His army fought like cornered animals. They destroyed an enemy force 3 times their size. Han Xin never lost a battle in his entire military career. But here is what the history books rarely emphasize. Han Xin did not win because he was the strongest man on the field. He won because he understood something most commanders never grasped. The battlefield was never the primary theater of war. The primary theater was the mind, his enemy's mind, his own soldiers' minds, and most dangerously, his own mind. Now consider this. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, perhaps the most celebrated military genius in European history, marched 685,000 men into Russia. He had won dozens of campaigns. He had redrawn the map of an entire continent. His enemies feared his name before they feared his army. He was destroyed, not by a stronger army, not by a smarter general, by a Russian commander named Kutuzov who did almost nothing. Kutuzov retreated. He burned cities. He gave Napoleon exactly what Napoleon wanted, land movement, the illusion of progress, until the French army had walked itself into a frozen grave. Kutuzov's strategy had one name: patience. He understood that Napoleon's greatest weakness was Napoleon himself, a man addicted to action, a man who needed victory the way other men need air. Give him silence, and he would fill it with mistakes. 2 men, 2 different eras, 2 completely different approaches. One fought with fear. One fought with nothing at all. Both won. And somewhere between those 2 stories lives a principle so ancient and so consistently proven across human history that it cannot be called coincidence. It can only be called law. The man who never lost a war was never simply the man with the largest army. He was a man who had mastered something far more dangerous. What that is changes everything you think you know about power. Most people study war the wrong way. They study tactics, formation, weapons, numbers. They read about battles as if the outcome was decided on the day the fighting began. But history's greatest commanders understood a different truth. By the time the battle starts, the war is already over. The winner was decided in the weeks and months before a single sword was raised. Sun Tzu wrote it plainly more than 2,000 years ago. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. A line so famous it has become almost meaningless, repeated in business seminars and motivational posters until its teeth were pulled out. But read it again, slowly. Subdue the enemy without fighting. He did not say avoid battle. He said the goal was to make battle unnecessary, to win before the contest begins. Robert Greene, in the 33 Strategies of War, observed that most people bring emotional energy to conflict. They react. They escalate. They mirror aggression with aggression. And in doing so, they hand their opponent the most valuable thing in any conflict: predictability. The commander's history remembers Hannibal, Caesar, Alexander, Genghis Khan, Wellington were not remembered because they were braver. In many cases, they were outnumbered, under-resourced, and fighting on unfamiliar ground. They won because they had mastered 3 capacities their opponents had not: the capacity to wait without appearing weak, the capacity to deceive without appearing dishonest, and the capacity to see clearly while everyone around them was operating on emotion. These are not ancient military secrets. They are principles of human nature, and they work just as precisely in a boardroom, a negotiation, or a moment of personal conflict as they did on the plains of ancient China. In 216 BC, Hannibal Barca led a Carthaginian force against the Roman army at the Battle of Cannae. Rome had 80,000 soldiers. Hannibal had fewer than 50,000. Every numerical calculation said Rome would win. Hannibal had spent weeks, not days, studying how Roman commanders thought. He knew they were disciplined. He knew they pushed forward when they sensed weakness. So he designed a trap that looked exactly like weakness. He placed his least experienced troops at the center of his line and let them bend backward under Roman pressure. The Romans pushed harder, driving deeper into what felt like a collapsing enemy. What they were actually doing was walking into the jaws of formation that folded around them like a closing fist. By the time Roman commanders understood what had happened, 60,000 of their soldiers were dead. Hannibal never surprised Rome with strength. He surprised them with their own confidence. Before any conflict, personal, professional, or otherwise, the person who has studied the opponent's psychology already holds the advantage. Not their resources, their psychology, what they believe, what they fear, what makes them overextend. Preparation is not logistics. Preparation is understanding the mind across from you. Kutuzov's retreat before Napoleon was considered cowardice by the Russian nobility. They demanded he stand and fight. They call him a traitor in private. He ignored them entirely. He understood something that Napoleon, surrounded by yes-men and drunk on momentum, could not see. Napoleon's army was a machine that required constant victory to function. Morale, supply lines, political pressure back in Paris. All of it depended on forward movement. Give it nothing to conquer, and it will begin to consume itself. Silence, strategic withdrawal, non-response, the refusal to react, is one of the most psychologically destabilizing forces in any conflict. It removes the opponent's ability to calibrate. When you do not respond as expected, the aggressor has no mirror. He begins to project. He begins to doubt. He begins to make decisions based on fear rather than information. In modern life, this principle is everywhere. The negotiator who speaks last wins. The executive who does not react to provocation forces the room to recalibrate. The person who does not need the approval of others becomes profoundly difficult to manipulate. Stillness is not absence. It is pressure applied invisibly. Genghis Khan was one of history's most deliberate architects of reputation. Before his armies reached the city, stories had already arrived. The stories were often exaggerated, sometimes by his own design. Messengers were released rather than executed. Survivors were allowed to flee, so they could carry reports of what they had witnessed. Fear traveled faster than cavalry. Many cities surrendered without a siege because the psychological war had already been won. This is not about intimidation. It is about understanding that perception precedes reality in almost every human conflict. How a negotiation is framed before it begins determines how both parties behave within it. How a leader is perceived before they speak determines how their words land. The most powerful people in any room are often those who have shaped the story before they arrived. Control the context, and you control the conclusion. Here is what none of these generals wanted known. Every one of them, at some point, nearly destroyed themselves. Han Xin was eventually executed by the very emperor he helped create. Hannibal spent his final years running from Rome as a fugitive and died by his own hand rather than be captured. Napoleon, the man who redrew Europe, died in exile on a small island in the South Atlantic, dictating memories to servants. The dark truth about mastering power is this. The same psychological precision that makes a person unconquerable in conflict can make them impossible to live alongside in peace. The skills that build empires are not the same skills that sustain them. History's greatest commanders won every battle, but many of them could not win a quiet war, the one inside themselves. The man who never lost a war is a myth. Every great commander lost something. The only question is whether they chose what to lose or let it be chosen for them. The battlefield changes. The weapons change. The uniforms change. But the principles beneath every conflict, patience, perception, preparation, and the mastery of one's own psychology, these have never changed and they never will. The greatest commanders in history were not superhuman. They were students of human nature, of timing, of the space between action and reaction, where all real decisions are made. The man who never loses is not the man who never faces opposition. He is the man who has learned to see clearly when everything around him demands panic. That clarity is not a gift. It is a discipline. And disciplines, unlike talent, can be chosen. Disclaimer: This channel has no direct affiliation, partnership, or official connection with dark psychology, power, wealth mindset, or self-mastery as branded entities. All content is independently produced for educational and informational purposes only